Welcome to Paranormal Palace Radio, where truth equals reality, and truth is often stranger than fiction.
Hello everyone, welcome to Paranormal Palace Radio. This is your host, Royce the Redneck Radio Man, and joining me today is Nancy Tetre, and I may have gotten her name slightly wrong, and I'm more than happy for her to correct it if I did. I want to apologize to people that were here 2 hours ago at 11 a.m. when I was supposed to have Patrick Schoenard. We're supposed to talk about Forgotten Worlds. I called the man. I got his answering machine. I'm not sure if he got hung up in traffic or, something prevented him from being at the telephone. I'm sure he had good reason. I mean, these things do happen. But I want to let everybody know I will be rescheduling that show. And I will be posting to all my groups and Facebook groups and everything else to let everybody know when that show goes live again. Moving on with the present show, however, Nancy here, she is known as the Psychic Skeptic. She has her own website at www.theskepticpsychic.com. And she also has a book out, her newest book. She's got more than one, actually. Is Psychic Intuition, and if you scroll down below her description, you'll see a link to it at Amazon, but you can also go directly to Amazon. That just, before you click here and I get my commission, maybe you don't mind my shameless plug, but at any rate, I'm pretty sure you can also get a link to it from her website, and if you go to her website, you can learn more about her. For people out there that would like to call in, my call-in number is right there below the chat room, is 832-632-7904. And to listen to the show live, if you're not at the website right now, you can either go to www.paranormalpalace.com or www.talknowradio.com. And the show is being simulcast at both locations right now, as I'm starting a new variety show at TalkNow.com that covers everything, including the paranormal. So when I have a paranormal show, I broadcast from both, and when I don't, I just broadcast from the new show site. At any rate, I'd like to, welcome Nancy to the show. And Nancy, how are you doing today?
Pretty good. Thank you. Thanks for the introduction. I'm just going to make a slight correction, if I may. It's actually, I'm known as the Skeptical Psychic, and the name of my website is theskepticalpsychic.com.
Oh, and I said Skeptic Psychic, and it was Skeptical.
Yeah, the Skeptical Psychic.
Okay, thanks for correcting me on that one, because I did not see that AL in there for some odd reason that I can't tell you why I didn't.
That's fine.
Okay, at any rate, what I like to do is usually have people, I guess, tell my listeners what it was that got them interested in whatever their topic is they're covering, because that's usually a good icebreaker. So why don't you tell everybody what drew an attorney to the psychic field?
There's nothing natural that would draw an attorney to the psychic field. So it had nothing to do with being an attorney. I can only tell you that I'm not one of those people who started out, at a very young age seeing ghosts and predicting the future and seeing auras. In my family, there's nobody psychic. We didn't talk about psychic stuff. It really didn't exist because they're very, a very academic family. And I really didn't I had a couple weird experiences, but I kind of put them aside. I didn't really think about them because I didn't know what to do with them, which I think is what most people do. And it wasn't until I got into my sort of middle age and I was, practicing as an attorney in New York, and I had a very powerful, totally spontaneous mediumship experience. And even then, I sort of said, nah, or, that was just so weird. I don't know what to do with it. I couldn't control it. So, and now it's gone. So what do you do with it? So I didn't think about that much, but, I actually studied with one of my mentors. His name is Dr. Ron D'Angelo. He's a psychologist in New York, and he was very busy developing this new psychology called intuitive Gestalt psychology or psychotherapy. And he was supposed to be writing a book about it. And I had a couple of dreams about him. And I called him up and I said, Ron, I dreamt about you. And he said, well, I charge for that. And I said, I'm not paying. But I had these dreams and you were covered with mold. And he said, what do you mean mold? And I said, green stuff. And I think it means that you're not writing this great book that you're supposed to be writing about intuitive Gestalt psychotherapy. And I said, I would be glad to help you, any way I can. I think I write pretty well. And, or if you want to bounce ideas, whatever, but you got to get that book out there. It's really important. And he sort of gave me a yeah. And he said, I'll think about it, but he didn't call me back for about a half a year, which is typical of him. And in the meantime, I thought, well, if he's not going to write this book about intuition, I got to write it because, it's important. So I thought originally I was going to write about the psychology of intuition. And I thought it was going to be pretty clear-cut. I figured psychologists knew what they were doing and that this was sort of a phenomenon that at least, everybody knows what intuition is, and what I discovered was that psychologists were not at all interested. They called it other things, like empathy, resonant empathy, transference, countertransference, all of which aren't really it. Where they talk about these, like, weird, uncanny moments, where the psychotherapist might actually be able to read their client's mind, but, oh no, that's too weird. So they didn't really go into it. So then I studied neuroscience for a little while. I thought maybe they knew something about it, and they seemed to hate it even more than the psychologists. So eventually, then I started talking, that was like, just opened up everything. I started talking to these people who I thought were completely out in the fringes of society, psychics, mediums, medical intuitives, plant emotion specialists, crop circle people, poker players, government, military people, remote viewers, anybody and everybody who could tell me anything about intuition. And at that point, and I know this is a very long story to get to your answer, but I discovered that in order to really talk about this field of intuition and to understand what this psychic stuff was, because it was all new to me, I was going to have to learn what it was from the inside. So I trained for about 10 years with a well-known psychic detective and also a bunch of other mediums and medical intuitives. So that's how I got into it. So it had absolutely nothing to do with being an attorney, other than I happened to be an attorney when I had some strange experiences.
Well, that leads me to be curious, though, that as to whether or not the people you work with are aware of the fact that you're a psychic or a medium.
Well, I'm no longer working in a law firm. So I don't have to worry about them. It was not anything that I ever volunteered as information. And what I'm discovering is that there are people in many, many different professions and fields where they have this ability, and they don't talk about it either. So it's this incredible, taboo topic. And usually, I got to a point, I don't care. I'll bring it up anywhere. I'll talk to anybody about it, and I don't care what they think of me. But almost invariably, I will get pulled aside by somebody, and usually most people, and they'll say, I've had this really weird experience, or I know somebody has, So everybody has had some connection to it, almost everybody.
Okay. Well, yeah, and there's a lot of people out there that are psychics, and some of them are good legitimates, and, other ones are not quite so legitimate, as I'm pretty sure you're aware. It's like anything else, whether it's UFOs or ghosts or, psychics or, even stuff non-paranormal related. You got your honest and your dishonest in every facet of life, and that's just part of living life, in other words. But it's still a very fascinating subject, and, there are some other psychics that I've talked to that do link intuition to psychic ability. Some people would say claircognizance is usually linked to intuition, and it's an ability to have a knowing of things that, pardon me, most people would not know. In other words, it's not like it came from a book or some kind of learning, or you're not really sure where it come from. Are you by any chance familiar with that?
Oh, of course. I write about it.
So,
in fact, I compare that a little bit to autistic savants.
To what now?
Okay. All right. Autistic savants are a really special subgroup of people who are autistic.
Ah.
And these particular people have these absolutely unreal abilities, or these talents. Usually it's only one talent. Although you had some people, I don't know if you ever heard of a guy named Kim Peek, but he was the guy who they based the movie The Rain Man on. And he had abilities to, he memorized, I don't know, word for word, I think he had 12 or 14,000 books that were totally memorized. He could read them forwards and backwards. He could read with his left eye and his right eye simultaneously. You'd ask him like a bit of sports trivia or history trivia or anything, and he could instantaneously give you an answer. A lot of these savants, they're called human calculators, because if you say to them, what day of the week was, 10,542 years ago, on such and such a date, and they'll tell you what day of the week it was almost instantly. So these people have some ability, it's a human ability that the scientific community hasn't quite figured out, what it is or where it comes from or why it exists. But I believe that it's quite similar as a way of thinking, as a way of processing information, as what psychics do.
That's very fascinating, because you're the first person I've heard that's mentioned that term. So it's totally new to me. You're educating me here on this one. I got to ask you, does your book go into any detail about this?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I go into a lot of detail about it. There's another group of people who I think psychics are actually similar, the way that they process information is very similar. It's a group of people, they're called synesthetes. I don't know if you've ever heard of them. They're people who have it's a crossover of sensory information, so they might see sounds as color.
Right.
You know what I'm talking about?
Oh, I know exactly what you're talking about. I happen to have an author on that had a book out about it called Synesthesia, I think it was. I want to say her name was Andrews. It's been a long time, but she was a very fascinating interview.
When I first started researching this book, there was one book out by a Dr. Richard Siddewick, and there were a couple of incredibly obscure articles on this, and nobody had ever heard of it. And just, within the space of the last 10 years, it's become extremely well known. But it's a neurological condition, and they don't quite know what causes it, but you can experience a thing like people taste shapes, numbers or letters of the alphabet will actually have personalities, which is why they can memorize huge, they can memorize all the decimals in pi, because they can see it, they can feel it, they can sense it in a different sense. Anyway, I think psychics are also very, very similar to synesthetes in the way that they process information, and I do talk about that in my book.
Okay, well, just out of curiosity, because I haven't really been into your book yet. I haven't had a chance to get a copy. Being on disability, I don't get to buy very many books, but I was going to say, can you give us an idea about what all you do cover in your book?
Sure. It's the name of the book is Psychic Intuition, Everything You Ever Wanted to Ask But Were Afraid to Know. And it's just come out. It's doing quite well. It's all over the place. And basically, a lot of people have called it groundbreaking because what I do is I try to explain to people who either believers and non-believers, okay, what is psychic ability? And I don't, it's not a book like, 12 Easy Steps to Become Psychic, because I don't think it's that easy. I think you have to really understand it, and I think you've got to have a lot of discipline if you're not naturally psychic, but you can be, because I think everybody can be. I think it's a relearning of a very innate ability that we have. But anyway, in the book, what I do is I explain to people what it is and how it works and why it is that some people are psychic and some people are apparently not, and why the ones who are not just don't see the same things. I also explain the difference between, for example, psychic and psychotic or crazy. You know, what's the difference between a psychic vision and a hallucination in any one of the five senses? And I go in, I explain all of that. So hopefully by the end of, reading my book, people not only start to understand what it is, that it's not some screwball, thing, and it's also not merely some incredible gift that only some special people have, and it's not magic. We can all do it, because I've done it. I'm living proof, and if I can do it, anybody can do it. And it's something that is accessible. You just got to understand what it is. So I explain it in terms of our existing science and psychology, and I also explain in terms of my own experiences, learning how to do it.
Well, I know personally, I think a lot of it goes into the fact that, most kids growing up are not really taught about it. I mean, how many skills do we have to be taught before we really use them a lot as grown people? And if something's not really, nurtured growing up, well, then if you want it, you'd have to nurture it once you're grown.
Yeah, well, it's worse than that, actually. I mean, I understand it's kind of like, if you don't use a muscle, then it kind of atrophies. It's not just that. But we get trained from a very early age to start using language and communicating. Well, the second that you start doing that, all of a sudden your thinking has to be organized in a particular structure. Okay? And you have to start thinking logically. Otherwise, if you don't, people think you're nuts, and you won't communicate effectively. And when you start using language, you're limited to whatever the words are that you know and that are in your cultural experience of your own language. So you may not have words for things, experiences that exist outside of what, the general norm of the community is. So your process of thinking gets kind of trampled on by this, left brain linguistic thing that we do when we all have to communicate. So you have to unlearn it. You have to go back to a place of kind of experiencing your life with no language. And that's really hard.
Yeah, that's really very interesting to me what you're talking about, because I've read online before about symbolism, that in ancient times symbols were really partially used because they can express things that words cannot express. And I'm getting from what you're talking about that perhaps this symbolism can kind of connect to this psychic intuitive side and give you more information than what your language can. Would you say that I'm onto something here?
Oh, I'd say you're definitely onto something. Yeah. And I'll tell you one other thing is, people think that psychics are, you can read the future, you can magically somehow everything. Well, it doesn't really quite work like that. What happens is, and there are different shades, it's like different flavors of experience, okay, in the psychic world, but it's not always as dramatic as like one of the experiences of our five physical senses. It might be a little bit ambiguous, and you get information, you get these little bits and pieces of they're like puzzle pieces of information. You might get an image here and a sound here and a thought there, and you say, well, what the heck? What does that mean? And your brain has to reassemble them in a way that makes sense. And when it's trying to interpret the information, you've always got to be asking yourself, well, is that a symbol? Is that, is the eagle that I'm seeing in my mind's eye, is that a symbol? Does that mean the United States? Or am I seeing an eagle because there's going to be an eagle that's going to be at a particular event, and that's going to be a clue? So you're constantly working with potential symbols, but you're usually working with the way that I describe it is that the psychic senses are like shadow images of our 5 physical senses. It's our brain's way of making sense for us. It's like a code of data. It's just vibrational data that's out there, and we don't know what it means. So our brain kind of puts it together in a format that we're used to, and then we got to figure out, well, what does that mean?
Okay. Now, do you think that these rules you're talking about, everything you're describing, it applies to all the clairs that go that are involved with psychic ability?
Yeah, and I think the one that is maybe that doesn't correspond to one of the 5 physical senses is this. I mean, there are different names for it. Originally, people used to, when they talk about clairsentience, they talk about sense of touch, but also the sense of knowing. Some people talk about claircognizance or clear knowing. But it's that sense of knowing that we were talking about earlier with the, like, what I was saying was similar to autistic savants. That's a kind of psychic sensing. It just doesn't have a corollary in our world of, our 5 senses.
Right.
We don't have anything like that. So that's kind of unusual, and it's always a weird feeling when it happens. You just know, and you say, well, that's just impossible. Not only do I have no sensory data coming in on that, at least that I know about, I have no information on this. There's nothing that I would know in my brain. I got nothing, and yet I am absolutely certain of something.
Right. Now, we were talking about this. One of the things I was going to ask you is, in your opinion, do you think it's possible that it's a part of you're using your intuition to help you, say, like your conscious mind connect to your subconscious mind, and maybe your subconscious mind is what connects to the Holy Spirit of God or another realm or dimension that maybe brings this information into a form of knowing?
That's a completely loaded question.
I did not mean it that way, I promise. But while you were talking, that came into my mind.
Yeah. Let's see. Okay, so let me put it this way. For what I did in explaining psychic ability is I completely stayed away from anything like, what is psychic phenomena, or what is spirit, or what is God. I do absolutely believe that there are connections, but that's my personal belief system, and I know that I think initially it doesn't serve a purpose to try and convince people about the reality of this if they don't share the same belief system. So I stay away from that. What I do explain is my definition of intuition. A lot of people say, psychic ability is totally different from intuition. Well, I disagree. I think that intuition for me operates on a sliding scale. And on the one end, the most conservative end, you had educated guesses. That's a form of thinking. And you might be missing a little bit of information here or there, but you're willing to make a pretty good guess. And most people, most skeptics too, are willing to accept that as a real thing. You move it, with this sliding scale, and it's on a ratio of 2 things, okay? Conscious to unconscious information and rational to irrational information. So you move the bars a little bit more towards the center, and you get, your kind of ambiguous gut feelings, hunches.
Right.
It's more emotional, but you can't really explain it. You're missing more information, but it still feels really strong. So now you're working with it. The information is more irrational and it's more subconscious. You get all the way out onto the other side, the far side of the scale, and now you're working with almost no conscious awareness, and you're working with almost completely irrational data. And you have no you're not working with information. You know, our senses are constantly giving us information, or our brains are, and out there you're working with almost none of that. But somehow, in some way, your brain is able to process information without you. And we're not used to that as a concept. Not only can your brain produce really good, accurate information without your conscious awareness, but when you do become aware of it, it may not be your job to interpret that information, because actually the job of interpreting that information may belong to somebody else. Which is why skeptics, a lot of the times, they think, oh, you know, those psychics, they're so phony baloney. You know, they're doing cold readings and people are just feeding them the information, or they're just so starstruck. They're saying, oh, yeah, you know, I know what you're talking about. No, it doesn't quite work that way. I mean, sometimes, yeah, and that's a sign of a bad psychic, but the way this does work is that I may get the craziest information in my head, or images. I may have no clue of how this could apply to anything, or you, or whatever, but I have to put it out there. It then becomes your job, if I'm reading you, to say, oh yes, I know exactly what you're talking about, because that's important to me, because. Okay. And the story, if you have time, I'll give you a quick example. I was doing a reading for a woman once. She wanted me to get in touch with her former nanny who had passed away. I thought she was talking about her nanny for her kids. So I gave her some information. It seemed to be pretty accurate. And I then sort of went back in and I was trying to get more information, and I saw in my mind an image of a skeleton, which wouldn't be so unusual if you're reading somebody who's passed. Okay? But then the skeleton kind of dissolved and disappeared, and the only thing that was left were the teeth. And I thought, well, that's odd. And then the teeth began to look like those, I don't know if you've ever seen those little, like, wind-up chattering teeth.
Yes.
You know, those little crazy things where you jump. Anyway, it started to look like that, and it's chattering away. And I'm thinking, oh, no, I cannot tell this poor woman, you know, that she's asking me to get in touch with her dead nanny, and I'm seeing these, like, crazy chattering teeth. And I just had to force myself to say, okay, listen, I got to give you what I'm seeing. It doesn't make any sense to me. And I explained it to her, and she started laughing and crying at the same time. She said, oh, my God, that's my nanny. I said, what the heck are you talking about? She said, my nanny, because apparently it was her nanny, used to, and she was an elderly lady, every night before she'd go to bed, she'd take her dentures out. But she would take them in her hands, and she would, like, chase my client around the house when she was a little girl with the dentures in her hands, like, you know, chattering them at her, like they're biting teeth.
Wow.
Who would have thunk? You know, it just, in other words, it wasn't my job to interpret the accuracy or lack of accuracy of that information. My job was simply to be a conduit and deliver it.
Right. And that was really kind of funny, I thought.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, exactly.
Okay. Well, I just wanted to let you know real quick like that. I wasn't trying to pull a loaded question on you. The thing was, while you were talking, I got to thinking about a book out by Marie Jones that I read called The Trinity Secret. And part of what she does with the Trinity is the subconscious, the conscious, and the unconscious, or was it superconscious, something like that, and connection with the Holy Spirit. And then I got to thinking about the, you know, psychic and puzzle. So I really just, it honestly came to my mind. In other words, I wasn't trying to put you on the spot. It's just something I thought, you know, was very interesting, in other words.
Oh, of course, and I do believe there's an absolute connection. But in order to speak to people in a way that they will hear, sometimes talking about that doesn't serve the purpose. Yeah,
and I can see why also. There's some very touchy subjects out there for, you know, some people. You know, not everybody's accepting of everybody else's belief system, and some people, you know, shut down and rather not talk about it. So I can understand where you're coming from on that. but it's still, at least from my perspective, something I would like to investigate a little bit further, if you know what I mean.
Absolutely.
Because I'm always looking to learn, if you know. Well, I mean, I think everybody would be better off if they were always looking to learn.
Sure.
And, I don't really know an awful lot about, psychic ability. I know I've read before that, everybody is a medium or has a mediumship, pardon me, that hasn't been developed yet for one reason or another. And one of the things you brought up earlier that got my attention was this idea of getting your mind wired to go one way, like verbal communication, being an extra hindrance to just it laying dormant. In other words, it's kind of like a double whammy, because I'd always viewed it as just a single whammy. But, the more I think about it, there's a lot of food for, thought in that direction, because I know a lot of people, just to give an example, if they're used to going to work through one path, you'd send them down another path, they get lost. It's kind of like a human brain, and a lot of people are geared to go for one programming, one track, in other words.
Well, exactly. And what I do talk about in psychic intuition is I talk about what happens is that, and it's a little bit of a complicated process, but once you start speaking a language and thinking in that language and thinking in those words, and I show through scientific experiments, many of them, words can actually influence whether or not you will have a sensory perception. So, if you have words that they can alter it, for example, there's this, they did studies on something they call the color grue, which is a combination of green and blue, and there's certain cultures in the world that don't see blue and green as being separate. They see them as one color. So they ran some studies, and what was interesting what they discovered, that because the two halves of the brain think differently, the right is more holistic, the left is more linguistic and is a place of language. Well, if the left brain is exposed to a color, and then underneath it you write the name for the color. So if you have let's suppose you put a spot of blue up, and you write the word green underneath it. If the left brain sees it, it's going to call it whatever it was called in its linguistic name. So it'll call it green. If the right part of the brain sees it, because the right brain doesn't read, it's going to call it blue. So your language, this is what's so weird, will actually determine your reality. And that's why people, if they get too much stuck in language, they'll literally stop seeing things. So all this psychic stuff is literally invisible to them.
That is really fascinating. And, it's got me to thinking, because people's minds, the way people's minds work, and you're, I think, covering a very important issue here, that, certain words you use will program one half of your brain, and certain words or things you look at can program the other, like your two hemispheres are, geared to learn through different sensory input.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
And I'd never really realized it that way before. But it does make a lot of sense, because your left side is more analytical, and because it's analytical would probably require a teaching type thing, whereas your right side is more intuitive, in other words.
Yeah, and we're completely unaware of the battle that goes on. I also wrote about, there was a documented case a long time ago. There was a woman who, I think she had, I don't know if she'd had split brain surgery done to separate the two halves, the two hemispheres of her brain because of having epilepsy, or whether it was an organic thing. But in any case, the two hemispheres didn't talk to each other the way normally our hemispheres talk to each other. And so she'd have one hand that would start grabbing her neck, and she'd try to strangle herself, and the other hand would be trying to pull it away. It sounds like a cartoon. but it's for real. And they discovered she had a death wish, and one half of her brain was trying to accomplish it, and the other half was fighting it off. And a lot of our experience of reality is engaged in that kind of a dispute between our hemispheres. It's usually the left hemisphere, the analytic, the linguistic one, that wins out. And that's the one that we recognize as our conscious brain.
Well, that would definitely make a lot of sense, especially in what they say is true, the male population, who tend to be a little more analytical to begin with. But real quick, I want to remind everybody that her website is www.theskepticalpsychic.com. And that's what she's actually known as to everybody who knows her personally, is the skeptical psychic. Now, I'll be honest with you guys and her right here and now. It doesn't make sense for her to, at least from my perspective, believe in psychic intuition and to teach about it while saying she's a skeptic. The two seem to kind of contradict each other, but I'm pretty sure there's a place she draws a line on that. And before I let her get to that, I want to also remind everybody, if you want to call in and ask questions, you can call 832-632-7904. And you can also go to www.paranormalpalace.com or www.talknowradio.com and get into the chat room and ask questions in the chat room if you're a little bashful to get on the telephone, for example. Her book can be bought at any major bookseller like Barnes & Noble and Amazon. And I also got a link to it here underneath her description, which will be in my archives tomorrow or the next day. So, Nancy, you want to tell me a little something about how you're a skeptical psychic, yet at the same time believing in skepticism? Is there some kind of a drawing line in there somewhere?
Yeah, that disturbs a lot of people. In fact, I was giving a lecture once at a university, and there was a professor at the end of it who was absolutely just incensed. Yeah. He said, "How dare you call yourself a skeptic when obviously a believer? I mean, how dare you?" And I mean, he was ready to come to look into a fist fight over this. It was amazing. I said, "Look, I have a completely different definition of what's skeptical and what's appropriate. Most people, professional skeptics or a lot of people in the scientific field, they call themselves skeptics. They think that it's, that they're just being rational and, trying to go for what is most logical, when in fact what they're doing is they have an entire belief system. They're really like religious zealots, and they don't understand that when they automatically refuse to investigate something because they've already dismissed it as being impossible, they've engaged in a religious act. They have a belief system that they've already determined something is impossible and that their world is the only possible world. So when I say skeptical, what I mean is, every time I do a reading, I'm always asking myself, are you sure? Is this right? But through, more than a decade of constant, I used to argue with my teachers all the time. I used to dismiss everything I did. I said, "Oh, that's coincidence or a lucky guess or, it's probability, it's something." But it got to a point, you do it so many times and you say, "Oh, okay, I guess there's got to be something else going on here, and I would be stupid if I didn't investigate this, because it's just stupid to keep dismissing something when the data is indicating something else."
Well, I think you're making a lot of sense, because I think a lot of people need to remember that there's a difference between somebody that buys into something without checking it out, somebody that's skeptical about what they're checking out, good, healthy skepticism, and somebody who just says, "Hey, it's false face value." Two of those are opposite extremes. The one in the middle, the healthy skepticism, is usually the one I would prefer to go for. So, a lot of people think you're contradicting yourself when really you're not. And I really kind of realized that, but I kind of wanted the, audience to hear that come, straight from you as well. I thought it would be, pretty good.
Yeah, the other thing is, too, that I think that there are a lot of, psychics and believers out there, and I wish that they would question their own belief systems, because a lot of times I think they're just engaging in some wishful thinking, or maybe some fantasy stuff. They need to check it.
Yeah, I would tend to agree with you. I'm in a bunch of different Yahoo groups and Facebook groups. A lot of cases I like to post my upcoming shows and, let people know about it, in other words. And, well, you get to see a lot of stuff people post that they just put out there. One guy just recently posted yesterday, the day before, for example, that Obama was going to come on the TV today and tell everybody that planet Nibiru is in our solar system or something to that effect. And he just took it for face value from wherever he got it. And, of course, you can imagine a lot of people out there thinking this guy's lost it or something, because, the president ain't going to do that. But, you have to ask yourself, why don't people stop and say, wait a minute, is this true? Have I checked it out?
Well, on my website, theskepticalpsychic.com, I do have I call it prophecy and prediction page. And it's open to anybody who wants to make a prediction or prophecy. And what I try to do, and I add my own, what I do, some of them do sound completely ridiculous. And, obviously you can't know the answer until the event happens. So you're kind of left out on a limb. And you're out on a limb that possibly you could really have egg on your face and really look pretty stupid if you say something. So you kind of got to trust your own process and have faith that through whatever, you've gotten enough confirmations when you get this sort of type of a feeling or a thought that usually it's true, and go with it. Even if there's nothing to back you up, that, you don't have a choice. But what I try to do on this particular page is I keep track of predictions, and I try to match them up with real events. So then you can see, however many months later, or maybe years later, so it was true. And then start, because that's what it's all about. That's a form of feedback and verification. So you're not just, shooting off your mouth about something.
Yeah, which is a lot of what goes on. But, yeah, I can see where you're coming from. People like that, if it was me, I would suggest that you put out there that you're getting this. This is information that's coming into your psyche. But I wouldn't put it out there as a confirmed fact, in other words, because that's where, people really start to lose credibility. You know what I'm saying?
I think people have to be really careful about how they play with reality and other people's realities. It's like when I discovered, when I was doing my research, mediums always talk about, they'll say, I see your grandfather standing behind you on your right side, and he's wearing a hat, and he's smoking a cigar. Well, do they really see him? What I discovered is most of the time, no, they don't see them. Sometimes they do. But most of the time, they're not seeing anything with their physical eyes, but they're using the word to see. So we all get confused. We don't have a word, really, to explain a form of psychic seeing, with the third eye, with your mental screen, or your imagination, whatever you want to call it, that has a sense of not being a thought, but something a little bit more concrete than a thought. It's more reality-based, and yet you're not actually seeing it with your eyes.
It kind of goes back to the symbolism idea.
Absolutely.
Well, that's very interesting. Now, I was going to mention we've got about 15 minutes left in this show, and I always like to, when I see things are getting close to the end, make sure that I ask my guests if there's anything that I didn't, help them cover that they'd like to get out there, because it's, really my job as a host to help you get your information out there.
Yeah, not really. I mean, other than I hope that people will buy my book. I think people have been, I don't want to toot my own horn, but I know that you have to toot your own horn. So I will toot it, I guess. I mean, people have been pretty blown away by it. I think it's just opened up people's eyes to a completely different way of looking at this field. in a way that maybe feels a little bit more comfortable, a little bit more maybe accessible. So I hope that they do go and get the book. And again, it's called Psychic Intuition: Everything You Ever Want to Ask, but We're Afraid to Know. And I know you have it. You've got a link on your site, so hopefully they'll go through your site.
Oh yeah, and I'm also going to have links up at YouTube and the other places when I post it over there as well. I got to tell you, you're a very interesting guest, and you got a lot to say, and I can tell you've definitely done your research in this, and, you know, you're like anybody else, you've got your own opinions, but they're not just manufactured out of air opinions or, you know, got from other people without, you know, you can tell that you really went through a lot of work to form what you formed because you really and honestly wanted to know, in other words.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for saying that. And I mean, I've researched this book for about 10 years. And I've spoken with some of the most famous, you know, psychics and mediums and neuroscientists and psychologists in the world. It's been an amazing journey to do this. And it's been really fun. I love this.
Well, now that you did mention that, I got to ask you, and I hope we got time, we might override a little, what's the latest in neuroscience in connection to psychic ability?
They're not looking at it. I mean, studies have been done, particularly with, you know, meditation and brainwave states and that kind of thing. But to my knowledge, at least, as of now, I don't know of anybody let me take it back. There's a Canadian neuropsychiatrist, Dr. Persinger, who is doing some very, very cutting-edge stuff. He developed this field called neurotheology because he discovered that if you it's called transcranial magnetic stimulation, TMS, you stimulate the brain in a certain pattern with electromagnetic stimulation, that what happens is people will say that they experience, you know, God or angels or dead people or, I don't know, Krishna or Muhammad or whoever they're dealing with, but they experience them as if they're right there with them in a way that seems very similar to people having paranormal experiences. So, and he's been doing some incredible work. He's just a brilliant guy. But most of the mainstream neuroscientists, they don't have these experiences, so therefore they don't believe that they exist and that anyone who would have them would be delusional. So they've already sort of pre-written them off. And on top of that, it's too subjective for them. They like things that can be, you know, measured and quantified. And they're just beginning to get into the realm of of studying subjective phenomena like intuition. But it's really, you know, still in its infanthood.
Yeah, I'll be honest with you, though. I think science, when they do that, I think they're making a mistake. I think if they'll start investigating stuff that can't be quantified, what will happen is they will find something quantifiable in the process, but they're like, well, you're shooting in the dark, and they don't want to try it, in other words.
I totally agree with you, and I think it's only a matter of getting creative about figuring out what can you quantify. But you got to ask the question first, and they haven't really yet asked the question.
Yeah, nobody wants to go fishing in the dark.
Yes.
But, you know, some of the best discoveries in the world were made through fishing in the dark.
I agree.
But
it amazes me when I read what some of the best-known neuroscientists have been doing in terms of their studies, and they're asking questions basically that they already have decided the answer to. And I guess that's part of the scientific method. You got to set up your hypothesis. So they don't like this open-ended stuff. That's very uncomfortable for them, and it doesn't really get you a good grant either. And it's kind of, you know, I guess it's like being a politician. I mean,
kind of hard to do anything without those grants.
Yes.
Unless, of course, you know somebody rich.
Yeah. Uh-huh.
Get to be good friends with Dan Brown. He'll help you out now. Actually, that man has some fascinating books out as well. But I was going to say, also, you're you've studied psychology. Part of that is covered in your book, which is a fascinating area to me. I've had a man on my show called Seth Barber. He's a psychologist, and his book is out about to get to spiritual madness. And well, he's not dealing with just his main targets is bipolar and schizophrenics. That he has a belief that these are people that are having a spiritual or a psychic experience, and that the drugs is negating that, and instead of drugs that they should be getting is some kind of therapy that will help see them through the rough spot and out to the other side. Kind of like they're going through a night of a spiritual awakening, in other words. So, I kind of wonder what your findings were with psychology.
Well, that's interesting. It's interesting that you're saying that. I think a lot of people, for example, like there've been so many diagnoses of ADHD or ADD, which is also they're on the sort of autistic spectrum. But when people are given medications, it sort of flattens them, and they kind of lose a lot of their creative abilities or what made them exceptional without the drugs. So I think it's a real interesting line that you walk. You want to suppress all the bad stuff that goes with it, the condition, but you don't want to get rid of this, in the case, what he's talking about, the spiritual experiences or the creativity that makes them really interesting as individuals.
And one of the points he also made was the spiritual experience would be short term. I'm going to have a guy on this month, Sean Blackwell, and his book is Am I Bipolar or Just Waking Up, which is actually along the same theme, only Seth was approaching it from the psychologist standpoint. This guy's the patient standpoint. We'll get to hear his views on it as well. And from his perspective, he said he's went through this and came out the other side pretty good, and in the end, in other words. So, like you said, I think it's a fascinating topic, and I would encourage people to look into it. If there is a connection of some kind, then perhaps you should learn about it, in other words.
It actually makes me think, I don't know if you saw, there was a movie a few years ago called A Beautiful Mind, and it was about the Nobel Prize winner, John Nash, who's a mathematician at Princeton. And he was completely psychotic. And actually, I went to Princeton, and I remember seeing him hanging around the campus. But what happened was that when he got put on his whatever the medication was, antipsychotic medication, his abilities to do these extraordinary mathematical calculations and theories and things, it just sort of died. And he made the decision, I think, along with his wife at a certain point, to go off the medication so that he could be himself again. But it's a real rocky road, and so he couldn't get rid of all the hallucinations, but he was doing these extraordinary things in math.
There's also the withdrawal factor so rough. Just to let anybody know who is interested, I just scrolled down check all the upcoming shows, and that one was on the 16th of this month for anybody listening that wants to attend that. I was going to say we've got 7 minutes left. Do you have any last-minute thoughts?
Last minute. Gee.
Or should I say any final thoughts? I might have worded that one incorrectly.
Any final thoughts? I think just, maybe also just to let people know that in my book I give exercises that they can do, which are kind of, they're small exercises. They're not huge, and you can sort of do them, most of them kind of privately, so other people don't have to know that you're doing them. But things that will help you enhance your own sensing abilities, which ultimately are going to help you get more psychic. And I do think, what I discovered was that after I did all of this training to become psychic, I actually became a better lawyer, which seemed like that was just all wrong. I mean, I could couldn't imagine why that would have worked, but it did. And so I really want to get it out there that I think that if people can explore their own psychic abilities, not be put off by the word, and understand what it really is, that no matter what field they're in or what they're doing, it's going to enhance their professional abilities and their personal abilities.
I would say, I think it'll affect all facets of their life in one form or another, because they'll begin to intuit what's coming in advance and therefore be better prepared.
It puts you on what I call the superhighway of information. You know, you don't have the same guarantees that it's always going to be right, but when you're right, it's like lightning speed, and you say, oh my goodness, and you save time.
I've heard other psychics say the exact same thing. It's just like, it almost instantly just kind of like pops into your head, like a light switch pops on, in other words. Right,
and you got to trust it, you got to believe in yourself, and you got to go with it.
Okay. Now, also, I want to leave you an open door invitation to return to my show at any time. I'm sure you'll have other books coming up in the future, and always going to be happy to come on and tell everybody about what you got going on at any point in time. And remind everybody that the URL is www.theskepticalpsychic.com. And this is Nancy du Tetre or Tertre. And if I'm pronouncing it wrong, I do apologize. I think it's Tertre.
It's fine.
She's a very nice lady, as y'all just heard. She's a very well-informed lady. And I think she's probably got some information in here worth reading. And maybe real quick, like, you can mention some other books you might have.
Other books that I've written?
Right.
Well,
I'm not sure, but I thought I saw another book or two that you might have written.
Yeah. Well, I've written an art history book about the history of porcelain, which has nothing to do
with paranormal.
Psychic stuff. Yeah. But it's actually been listed, you'll see it, it's been out there. It's listed as one of the most authoritative works on European porcelain. So that's kind of a nice thing. I've also co-written and that, by the way, is called the Art of the Limoges Box. I've also co-written the memoirs of a New York City homicide detective. That's called Behind Criminal Minds. And I wrote a precursor to my current book. It was actually much larger. And so this is the trimmed-down version. And I do have several more books sort of in the works. So hopefully you'll be hearing more from me.
Oh, I certainly hope so. It's been a pleasure having you. Thank you once again for coming. And I'm going to leave you to the rest of your weekend. And I'm going to kind of move on and brief my guests after I get you off the air about my upcoming shows and any friends of mine I have on the links on the webpage they may want to visit. Thank you for coming. Been a pleasure. And let's stay in touch.
Thank you so much, Royce. I really appreciate it.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Okay, everybody. Now, just to give everybody a really quick briefing before we cut the show all together. Once again, I apologize for the earlier show. I'll let everybody know when I get worked out. This coming Tuesday, I'm going to have Marie Jones and Larry Flaxman, and we're going to be talking about their newest book. This book is from the future. It promises to be very interesting. I hope everybody can make it. And then after that, we're going to have Planetary Reality with William Von Host, who is actually filling in for the author of the book, Emery Valion, and I might be pronouncing that incorrect, who is overseas. In other words, I'm not sure he speaks perfect English or not. Then we're going to have on the 16th, Am I Bipolar or Just Waking Up, which I mentioned earlier. And I'm not going to go too much further down into the month and leave a lot of room to forget, because I can mention some of these as I go. But before I do go, remember everybody, I'm also starting to do a variety show at talknowradio.com. And I invite everybody to go over there because I will be showing all shows over there and only the paranormal ones over here. And don't forget to visit my friends at World UFO Today. Don't forget to click on my friends link and go over there and click on the banners to Supernatural UFO and United Paranormal International. And don't forget to click on the radio favorites. These are in the menu on the left, by the way. And you'll see banners to Gary Brown's show, Jim Harold's show, Micah Hanks' show, and Mark Snyder's show. All great radio hosts. If you love radio, I'm sure you'll enjoy it. And until the next time, y'all take care. And don't forget, I couldn't have a show without my listeners any more than I could without a guest. So if you're even listening, you're participating. Keep coming and let everybody know about it. Thank you.